Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for coming in for this concluding plenary session of the 14th Manama Dialogue on Sunday, the 28th of October. Let me begin this session by thanking His Majesty King Hamad for receiving so many of the delegates so graciously last night at the palace for a splendid dinner, and thank him also for his kind remarks about the IISS and about the Manama Dialogue process, a joint enterprise between the IISS and our wonderful hosts here in the Kingdom of Bahrain. This concluding plenary session is designed as a concluding plenary session. And last year we had a number of IISS voices give their thoughts, and we were told that that was an appreciated part of the Manama Dialogue agenda. So we are doing the same again this year and introducing on the stage of this concluding plenary four leading individuals of the IISS team, so that you can become more familiar with the work we're doing, and each of them will offer 6 to 8 minutes of concluding remarks, in some cases based on the special sessions that they chaired, and in one case offering general reflections on the regional environment. And the purpose of this concluding session is to try to draw together the threads of our discussion over the last 36 hours and to arrive at some useful analytical conclusions that will also be important for policymakers. The first person to address us is Dr. David Gordon. He is Senior Advisor for Geo-Economics and Strategy at the IISS. David Gordon spent a long time in U.S. government service. He was the head of the policy planning staff of the State Department and also vice chair of the U.S. National Intelligence Council, and then went on to work in the private sector, including at the Eurasia Group in New York. He joins us as a senior advisor for Geo-Economics, and amongst the big programs that he will be overseeing is a large project on the Belt and Road Initiative that we are conducting, and I've asked David to offer his reflections on the relationship between the Middle East and Asia, a subject that he's very well schooled in, and he comes to Manama fresh from some consultations in Beijing. So with that, David first.
Well, thank you very much, John, and good morning, everyone. Great pleasure to be here. In the brief time that I've been allocated, I want to touch on three topics at the interface of Asian Middle East relations. The first is the US-China trade war. The second, shifting attitudes in East Asia towards the Gulf region. And the third is some thoughts about the evolution or the possible evolution of China's strategy in the Belt and Road Initiative. So let me start with the US-China trade relationship. Yesterday morning, General Mattis said that while the relationship between the US and China has definitely become more competitive, that doesn't mean that it will be naturally and inherently conflictual. But it's certainly the case that in the last 6 months, the US-China trade relationship has become more conflictual with a effort by President Trump and the Trump administration to reset the commercial relationship between China and the United States and a defensive response by the government in Beijing. So what I want to explore with you today is the question of what you see is what you will get. Is that confrontation bound to continue? What are its origins here? And I think that to summarize, I think there are two views within the administration. There's one view that basically says you put trade pressure on China in order to get to a new, more balanced relationship with China. The second view is that the economic and trade relationship between the U.S. and China should be systemically downgraded, and that if those efforts succeed, China's centrality in global supply chains will be somewhat undermined, and there will be a return of manufacturing jobs to the United States. So in the context of the U.S. midterm election, there's no question that President Trump has taken a very hard stance on China. But if you go back and look at Trump's statements, both in the campaign, in the first year in office, I think he put at the center of his interaction with Xi Jinping the notion of doing a deal with President Xi on trade. So while it might be that the Palestinian-Israeli deal is the deal of the century, but the deal of the economic century, I think, for President Trump is much more a China economic deal. Now, which side are we going to see over time? And the exact answer to that, of course, is we don't know yet. Up through the election, the president will definitely continue taking a hard line. The Chinese complained to me last week when I was in Beijing that the Americans aren't even letting us know what they're really looking for. That's because the president didn't want to get near doing a deal before the election. I think the event to watch here is what will happen at the G20 meeting in Buenos Aires in about a month's time, when Xi Jinping and President Trump will meet together. And I do think at that point that the U.S. president will very much want to play his cards of having successfully hurt the Chinese economy. Xi Jinping is, I think, quite motivated to avoid a Cold War, a new Cold War with the U.S. So I think there's a reasonable chance of a turnaround here. Now, this is important because I think that the outcome of this will have an enormous impact on oil markets. The oil markets have been wavering between being worried about too little supply because of cutbacks in Iran's ability to export. General Petraeus told us about this the other night. And on the other hand, the notion that should the U.S.-China trade war continue and in fact escalate, then the downward pressure on global demand could lead to something of a price collapse. So thing to watch here is late November, but I do think that the chances of some kind of an agreement, I don't think it's going to be a grand bargain, but I do think we could have a move again towards some element of a negotiation around particularly the bilateral trade relationship. I returned from 2 weeks in East Asia. One of the most interesting evolutions over the last several years has been a a shifting expectation in East Asia, both among businesses and I think substantially among governments, concerning the relationship between the Gulf states and Iran. I think that up until a couple of years ago, and for a very long time, the expectation in East Asia was that Iran would be their most important commercial partner in this part of the world. And I think that about a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago, probably even before the 2016 US election, that began to change, partially because of the stronger performance of economies on the Gulf side, partially because of successful diplomacy by the Gulf states, and partially because of increasing skepticism that the Iranians would have the capability to really develop an investment framework that would be safe enough to accommodate large-scale foreign investment. Now, I don't want to overstate this, that I think that, that there remains issues in the minds of businesses in Asia about the Gulf states. I think that there's concern that the big themes in the Saudi 2030 program have been put off to the future, and India, for strategic and historic reasons, remains committed to having a very strong relationship with Iran. On the other hand, Xi Jinping made a visit to the UAE in July, and I do think that the relationship here in this part of the world are shifting. Very interestingly, there was a report in the Chinese media yesterday or the day before that the Chinese government had ordered the Chinese National Petroleum Company and Sinopec to go to zero imports of Iranian oil by the November 5th deadline. So I think that the expectations here about Iran being a natural commercial political hegemon in this region from the East Asian perspective have certainly declined over time. Finally, in just a couple of words on the Belt and Road Initiative. It's been 5 years since President Xi announced it, but I think the Belt and Road, which is intended to be literally a 25-year, 35-year project, is still in its relatively early stages. After starting out as a fairly multilaterally cast enterprise, and after China took the lead in creating a multilateral financial institution, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, I think in recent years, AIIB has taken on a much more nationalist direction. And I think that now there's been a lot of pushback against this. European interest in and support of the BRI has diminished very, very considerably. And in recent months, Pakistan, Malaysia, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia have all expressed a lot of concern about the terms of Chinese interaction in their economies, and in particular about what happens if debt accumulates. In the IMF meeting in Bali, there were very, very large discussions about the fact that most major international financial players do not want the IMF resources to go to countries so that those countries can bail out China in the case of project failure for BRI projects. As a result, I think the Chinese have begun looking for new partnerships. So I think that was part of the of the rationale behind President Xi's visit to the UAE back in July. But the most significant example of this was the importance that was given during Japanese Prime Minister Abe's visit to Beijing just a few days ago to a big conference between Chinese business leaders and Japanese business leaders on the theme of a joint China-Japan third-party investment alliance. And if you parse that apart, I think that without saying that this was about the BRI and engaging Japan more directly in the BRI, that was the sum of what was going on. So this creates, it seems to me, the likelihood that China is going to be looking to the Gulf region as a potential partner in BRI activities, and that if you look at the BRI maps, they sort of leave the Gulf out a little bit. But I think that we're in a new phase now, and I think Gulf states, along with Japan and others, could play a significant role in reorienting the BRI back to its more multilateral origins. Thank you very much, John.
David, that was marvelous, and I know a lot of people will have things to add and questions to pose about that. Our second speaker is Virginia Comolli. She trained as a pilot in Italy, then became briefly a policewoman in the United Kingdom, was an intern at the IISS, a research assistant, a research associate, a research fellow, a senior fellow, and now directs our conflict and security and development program, and is overseeing the building of our armed conflict database. And she has written widely on issues of transnational threats and responses to them, including a splendid book on Boko Haram and others. And she will address us on the relationship that was explored yesterday in plenary and this morning in special session between the Middle East and Africa. Virginia.
Thank you very much, John, and good morning, everyone. I think this year, Manama Dialogue really gave us the opportunity to discuss and explore a new arena for Gulf cooperation, and that's Africa and the Horn of Africa in particular. The relations between the two regions aren't exactly new. They do go back over centuries, and the regions do indeed share many economic and cultural ties. These relationships, however, have witnessed some ups and downs over history, and in the 2 decades following the Cold War, we've seen Gulf states somehow retreating from the region. But things have changed. Things have changed quite dramatically, owing to some significant geopolitical shifts in the region. Specifically, this was the deepening of rivalries among Gulf states and the war in Yemen, which have translated into renewed interest on the part of Gulf states in the Horn of Africa, which is now a region of greater strategic relevance. It is in this context that port and naval facilities on the Horn of Africa and the Gulf of Aden are now in the spotlight, both for a commercial reason and also because there are bases there that are used to launch military operations against the Houthis in Yemen. Also in the spotlight is the security of the Bab al-Mandab Strait, the southern entrance to the Red Sea, which indeed was the focus of one of the special sessions we just had this morning. So rivalries among Gulf states, on the one front we have the Saudis and the Emiratis, and then on the other front Qatar, Turkey, Iran, play out in multiple ways in the Horn of Africa. And we've seen how many bilateral agreements have been signed, and often they're signed and implemented indeed to counter the presence of rivals. And in addition, we've also seen the proliferation of other international actors that are now active across the Horn of Africa. Many international powers are there. Among all, China is very active and is expanding its commercial and military interests in the region, including through the setting up of its first overseas naval base in Djibouti. So it is against this very complex and crowded, I'd say, scenario that I'd like to make just some broader remarks that I think will have an impact on the long term. So, with the risk of stating the obvious, everyone has an interest in a peaceful Horn of Africa. Of course, the Horn of African states, African and Gulf neighbors, and also partners from further afield, EU, US, China, Japan, and many others. As we know, instability can breed further security challenges, being them conflict, criminality, piracy, radicalization, and terrorism. And sadly, we know that these challenges are very transnational, they are fluid, and can easily be exported abroad. In addition to that, of course, the security threats undermine trade. Around $600 billion worth of trade flow through the 25-kilometer wide Bab al-Mandab Strait each year, and depending on which statistics you look at, these amounts, it is equal to between 12 and 20% of global trade. So there are some incredibly significant commercial stakes here. But on the peace and security front, we've seen a momentous development over the past year, and that was the rapprochement between Ethiopia and Eritrea after 2 decades of hostilities. It is important to highlight here, however, that this peace was made possible through the involvement of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, and indeed the deal was reached in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. And the two countries, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, are really positioning themselves as true powerhouses in the Horn of Africa. And their growing influence has also made it possible for them to convince border rivals, Djibouti and Eritrea, also to enter in a dialogue. I find it very interesting from a strategic point of view, and also looking at the long term, to note that Ethiopia and Eritrea did not turn to the multilateral structure offered by the African Union, and instead they prefer a quicker bilateral and trilateral based approach through discussions brokered by Gulf partners. As we were reminded yesterday, despite some challenges, the African Union remains a strong institution, as Jean-Christophe Belliard mentioned yesterday. And the African Union peace and security architecture is underpinned by common aims and principles. However, the relationship between Horn of African countries and Gulf countries are built on a very different set of interests and principles that are indeed driven by strong commercial agendas and much more transactional agendas, such as, for instance, the establishment of ports along the East African coast. So what are the implications of all of this? Well, in return for investments and support, Horn of African states are expected to be loyal to their foreign partners in multiple ways, including when it is about supporting their position on the international arena. And this can be quite problematic, especially for smaller and weaker states that might find themselves caught in the crossfire of Gulf states' rivalries. To my understanding, it is only Ethiopia, which is the largest and fastest growing economy, and really in the African context, a regional superpower, that has managed to maintain its neutrality and to work with both Arab nations and also Turkey and Qatar. And indeed, it has been able to exploit this scramble for Red Sea ports for its own commercial benefits. But it is for smaller, weaker from an economic and political perspective states that these new relations can be very problematic. The second point is that also, in contrast with the multilateral approach of a process driven by the African Union, when it comes to these new types of peace agreements, the emphasis is less on democratization and the strengthening of good governance, and more on securitization, as exemplified by the build-up of military and naval facilities. And I'm highlighting these issues related to democratization and the strengthening of good governance because these are two key factors that many conflict experts around the world have highlighted as key to foster peace and stability in the long term. So with this in mind, one may worry that this new approach, albeit effective in the short term in fostering the normalization of relations among rivals, such as in the case of Ethiopia and Eritrea, might actually have a negative impact on the prospects for long-term peace and stability if the priorities of partners and foreign partners actually change. As we were reminded yesterday during the fifth plenary and also this morning during the special group session, the Horn of Africa still contains main areas of instability, insecurity, and also economic and political fragility. And although it is true that a number of gains have been made over the past year or so, peace remains fragile, and these gains need time to consolidate. And this leads me to another broader point, which in a way or another has been put forward by many speakers at this Manama Dialogue and previous editions, and that is pertinent to both the MENA region and Africa. What is needed to address security threats is much more than military operations. To quote the German Defense Minister Ursula von der Leyen, what we need is education, education, education. And others also have spoken about investing in the youth and the human capital of countries. Others have spoken about meritocracy and giving everyone equal opportunities. I've heard about unlocking resources and ensuring that all sections of societies have access to those resources. And we've also heard about female inclusion in economic and political life. So these factors are things that are needed, are indispensable in order to secure a safe and stable future. So all in all, my understanding is that all this is about is leveraging those shared and economic cultural ties between the Gulf and the Horn of Africa that I alluded to at the very beginning, in a way that fosters the peace and prosperity of both regions. It is clear from what we have heard from a number of participants that Africa needs infrastructure and trade, more than aid, some would also add. And Gulf investments bring just that. Over-reliance on one partner or a small handful of partners is a risky strategy, and it leaves you exposed to shocks and the risk associated with partners changing priorities. In this context, you cannot fault the diversified approach taken by many Horn of African states that are engaging with multiple Gulf partners, Europeans, American, Chinese, Japanese, and other Asians. But this means that they also ought to be ready to adapt to different models, different conditionalities, and different requirements vis-a-vis what is expected in return for those trade deals and those infrastructure developments that are currently on offer. Thank you.
Virginia, thank you very much indeed. Our third speaker is General Sir Tom Beckett. He served a number of decades in the British Armed Forces. His last official role was as Special Envoy for the Middle East for the Secretary of State for Defense, and in that capacity was constantly in the Middle East and North Africa meeting the leaderships of those countries, and we were delighted that we were able to appoint him earlier this year as the Executive Director of the growing IISS Middle East office here in Bahrain. Tom.
Thank you. Of course, as Dr. Chipman said, new to the IISS, and when we were discussing me coming on board, I did say, you know, I am neither a researcher nor an academic. And John said, don't worry, we've got plenty of those. And then lo and behold, I found myself sitting up here. So I think I've been dragged up here kicking and screaming. But as John said, I did travel extensively over the last few years from Rabat to Muscat. Part of that job was to observe what Emil Hakim describes as the 3.5 conflicts that are ongoing in the Middle East region, and the numerous confrontations, some of which are violent. Simplistically, I like to describe the threats to the region as twofold: the security threats, because there are plenty of others, and one of those is extremism, and the other was Iran, and within the Iranian threat there is an extremist element. And we heard yesterday from Secretary Mattis, the best way to confront a threat in the modern era is through alliances and coalitions. So last night I had a quick review of the alliances and coalitions that I've seen in the region in the few years that I was doing my last job. One predated it, but it was employed not so long ago, and that's the GCC Peninsula Shield. And we were reminded yesterday by Adel Al-Jubeir of the importance of the GCC. The next was the Global Coalition Against Daesh, and of course the strength of that global coalition was its focus on Daesh, and the weakness of that coalition was its focus on Daesh. Then after that, you had the KSA-led coalition that formed under UNSCR 2216 to deal with to restore the legitimate government of Yemen against the Houthi threat. Shortly after that, there was the Islamic Military Counter-Terrorist Coalition was formed, and the Secretary General is sitting in the audience right now. Of course, what's interesting about that Islamic Military Coalition is that with 40 or so signed up members, one Islamic country is not in, and there is probably no prospect of that Islamic country being invited to join. So it could be a coalition against to contain Iran. And then more recently, at the end of last year, we were told of the KSA-UAE Strategic Alliance, which we haven't heard much more about. There doesn't seem to be much flesh on the bones. So all those taken together, some to deal with extremism and some to deal with Iran, it's clearly, it would appear that none of them actually are the answer to what in English idiom would be called the answer to the maiden's prayer, because we then heard about the Middle East Strategic Alliance or Security Alliance that was posited yesterday by Secretary Mattis and then enthusiastically agreed with by both Adel Al-Jubeir and Sheikh Khalid bin Ahmed. If those alliances, if that final alliance is going to be the one that saves us, it is open to question about the other alliances that it's going to confront. And perhaps one of the areas that we could talk about in that regard is Syria, because Syria ostensibly started out as a question of dealing with extremism. The Global Coalition Against Daesh was there to counter the Daesh threat, the extremist threat. In the same vein, the coalition that formed after the Russian intervention at September 15, which, if anyone needs reminding, has made both Iran and Hezbollah more stronger in the region, was also its stated purpose is to counter terrorism. So you have two coalitions operating in the one battle space trying to deconflict. The US policy is for the enduring defeat of Daesh, but the mandate for the forces, and that's the mandate for the forces, but it also has a secondary piece, which is the withdrawal of Iranian forces or Iranian commanded forces. What's interesting there is that if the US forces are there and they are cannot be applied against the Iranian forces, then that's only on the political track. So for me as a soldier, I look and see the Russian-Iranian Hezbollah coalition, which doesn't seem to have particularly many constraints on the application of force, and yet the global coalition of Daesh is very careful about the application of force. So in the political track, we then come back to what struck me yesterday as the use of reconstruction as an instrument of, to put it nicely, conflict resolution, because it seems to me that it's being used as a carrot and a stick. The carrot is that Russia will be able to take its hand out of the mangle, because if they deliver political transition from Assad, then the West will invest. But of course, the stick is both, if Russia doesn't do that, they won't get their hand out of the mangle, and the poor Syrian people will continue to be in a unconstructed environment. And then if we turn to Iran, and this is the second threat and the coalitions that are building up against it. Again, Secretary Mattis said the regime does not speak for the people. Well, if the regime doesn't speak for the people, then either the regime needs to change or the regime needs to be changed. And I wondered what was the intention of what he said there. Rather contradictorily, of course, Adel Al-Jubeir said that Iran was being contained, but I don't think we see much evidence of that, and it'd be interesting to hear your views. But I think what should be reassuring for the region was Secretary Mattis saying that there was no pivot, that the US would remain committed, and I suspect the US's traditional allies would remain committed to the security of the Arabian Peninsula, no less. But both he and in the opening speech, King Abdullah's opening speech, referenced hope, hope for the region and so on and so forth. And again, it struck me that there was one party for which it looks pretty hopeless, and that's Iran. And again, another military maxim is, unless you are absolutely sure of yourself, don't corner a rat. But going back to, they got out of a hole in Syria through forming a coalition with Russia. Perhaps they'll get out of a hole by being cornered by forming another coalition, and maybe that will again be Russia.
Tom, thank you very much for an extremely crisp and disciplined presentation of a number of different military security coalition and alliance issues. The fourth and final speaker in this session is Dr. Kori Schake. She joined the IISS on the 2nd of February as the Deputy Director General. She has government experience in the White House, the State Department, and the Pentagon. Many years as a leading American academic strategist of her generation in California. Has written a number of books, the penultimate ones on civil-military relations with one then-General Jim Mattis, and the latest one, Safe Passage, arguing that there were special conditions that permitted for the gentle transition of hegemonic power from the United Kingdom to the United States. And I've asked her to speak a bit about some of the issues raised in her special session, but also to open up the discussion to think about how the US in future will engage with this region. Kori.
Thank you, Boss. So in this special session on nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, there were three things that I thought came out really strikingly and actually serve as a microcosm of the broader discussions, the tenor of the broader discussions that we had across the last couple of days. The first thing that came out in the special session was how much countries in the region are looking for reliable, renewable fuels for economic reasons, and also because of their concerns about climate change. And the real resentment of hypocrisy on the part of the United States to, for example, not hold Vietnam to the standards that we are holding countries in the region. A real concern about the way in which the Middle East as a region is treated differently in policies of countries from outside the region. The second thing that came out of our special session was the desire for regional applications of international safeguards where nuclear issues are concerned. Quite a lot of interesting thought being given to what are the regional applications and how can the Middle East, because it is treated distinctively as a region in the policies of other powers, how can it develop the kind of regional cooperation that would make that possible? And there were three really, I thought, creative suggestions. The first was development of a regional fuel bank, and the government of Jordan volunteering to be a host of that regional fuel bank. The second was a regional counterpart to Euratom that would set standards and make safeguards and safety and security of nuclear fuels. And then the third came up in the context of the Iranian nuclear negotiations, and that was the possibility for some kind of equivalent to the six-party talks that go on over the North Korean nuclear weapons program. Can countries in the region and the external countries who have been parties to those negotiations find ways to include regional voices other than Iran's regional voice? And what I took away from the discussion in the special session was how much should be possible that isn't yet possible for the countries of the region. And for me, it carried over into our broader discussions because I heard in people's commentary over the last 2 days for the effects of 4 big policy choices that are limiting the ability of what should be possible in the region. The first is the American withdrawal from the Iranian nuclear agreement. I thought it was striking that in Secretary Mattis's comments, he emphasized so strongly the threats that Iran poses for the region and for the United States and other concerned extra-regional countries. The nuclear threat of Iran was at the end of that list, not the start of that list. And that's clearly a rebalancing over the priorities of the prior administration, but I think also consistent with the fact that the previous administration focused almost exclusively on the threat of Iran's nuclear weapons programs, and there are lots of good reasons to worry about Iran's nuclear weapons program, but that wasn't the predominant concern of friends in the region. And so I think the American decision will have 2 effects. First, it will very much please America's traditional partners in the region, and it will very much displease America's European partners who have been essential to the effects of sanctioning Iran that drove them into the negotiations in the first place. So it looks to me like the American choice on withdrawing from the Iranian nuclear agreement will have beneficial effects in the region and detrimental effects in managing a broader coalition on that problem. The second policy choice that feels to me like it's reverberating through our conversations is the American government's decision to move its embassy to Jerusalem and to close the Palestinian consulate in East Jerusalem. Secretary Mattis notably answered a question from one of you delegates saying that it was not going to have a negative effect. I think that's widely disbelieved by countries in the region. And in fact, the third policy decision that seemed to me to be resonating is the return of the Palestinian issue to the center of the policy conversations in the region, whereas so much focus in the last 5 or 6 years has been on Iran and getting a hold of constraints on Iran's nuclear weapons program, on Iran's malign behavior in the region and beyond the region. I thought I heard a lot of conversation that suggested Palestinian issues are once again back in the center of the region. And that was even before the extraordinary and electrifying statement of the Omani foreign minister. The fourth big policy action that seems to me to be reshuffling the deck of priorities for the region is the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. I was struck that Secretary Mattis made the strongest statement I have heard any American government official make about the importance of respecting journalists and dissenting journalists in particular. I was also struck at how much in the German defense minister's comments that it was also prominent and also prominent. It seems to me that that's going to make extraordinarily difficult 2 things. The first is really cementing any kind of moral clarity between what the countries of the existing alliance, America, Europe, and its traditional partners in the region, seemed to me at the start of the Trump administration to have pretty good tools and pretty good cooperative instincts about isolating Iran and getting a handle on the many threats Iran poses to the region. I think that's now much harder because of these policy choices. It will be hard to get traction on the Saudi foreign minister's view that Saudi Arabia's vision of the region is one of light and Iran's vision is one of darkness. It seems to me it will be much harder to make an argument about the moral clarity of assisting or not assisting reconstruction in Syria. And which takes me to the Mesa Project, which came up in several people's commentary over the last several days. And it strikes me that this initiative was always improbable. Even if you could get all of the countries in the GCC back into alignment and cooperation, that there's very little appetite in the United States for a lot more commitment to the region. I too thought it was heartening that Secretary Mattis emphasized America's enduring commitment to the region. But I'm not sure 3 years ago an American Defense Secretary would have had to emphasize that quite to the same degree. And I think in general, American policy, while strongly committed to the defeat of Daesh and to the stabilization of Iraq and to continued positive developments in Iraq, that there is a sense that America's national security strategy and national defense strategy, focusing so much on the return of great power competition, is going to create competing priorities, in particular for American forces, in addition to American attention. The second reason I think the Mesa initiative is increasingly improbable is the contradictions in the Trump administration's own strategy. That is that while withdrawing from the Iranian nuclear agreement, withdrawing from the intermediate range nuclear forces agreement, that's a difficult time to be able to make the case that we need more treaties. And I think it would be impossible to get an enduring treaty commitment to America's traditional allies in the region through the Congress. Well, it's always difficult. Congress is always skeptical about those things, but in particular now, until we have a lot more clarity on the policy choices that led to the Khashoggi murder, Congress is going to be very concerned about that because the American public's very concerned about that. And so I think all of these things are, to some extent, reshuffling the prospects for progress and cooperation in the region and diminishing the likelihood of achieving things that should be possible for the countries in the region and their partners and allies elsewhere in the world.
Kori, thank you very much. I think that was an excellent model for how we tried to combine at the IISS analytical nuance with political frankness, which I think is the most helpful way to add to our debates. So with those thoughts, we open up the floor to your concluding thoughts, to the things that struck you the most. And I've got 5 or 6 people on the list. I'll have them all come in, and then each of us might respond to that. But I really hope that all of you will help draw the threads together and help us conclude. And the first on my list from Algeria, Adel Hamaiza. Adel, take the floor again.
Thanks very much. My question is directed to Dr. Gordon. Thanks very much for wonderful insights, most of which interest me deeply. The first question I have is, most sort of China-MENA watchers are sort of considering the ramp-up of interest in China in the sort of last decade or so. The Arab policy paper, Syria envoy, Djibouti port, Libya experience, everything from Duqm investments to, of course, a large proportion of Qatar's LNG and Saudi fuel going towards China. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on China's appetite for engagement when it comes to post-war reconstruction in Syria, possibly Yemen, and where things stand on that front. We heard of an oil and gas plus arrangement or idea from President Xi earlier this year. I'd also think it's important to disaggregate China when talking about BRI. And again, on Duqm, we're talking about Ningxia province, which was sort of doing those deals and apparently at odds with HQ. So just to think about that. Finally, my other question would be any comments or thoughts on complementarity or coordination or competition when it comes to China and India in the Gulf and MENA, and where India could fit into BRI beyond the sort of Gwadar-Chabahar competition we're familiar with. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Big menu. Bobby Gosh.
My question is for Sir Thomas and Dr. Schake. The one topic I didn't hear enough about, I felt I heard very little about, was Yemen. This is a security summit in a GCC country. I would have expected to hear a great deal more of Yemen, especially now that the conflict is drawing more attention, more negative attention in the West, in the aftermath of the Khashoggi murder. I'd be curious to know if the two of you felt the same way, and why you think that is, and what you think that tells us about the conflict, the fact that it got so little discussion here. Thanks.
Thank you. François Hesbourg.
Thank you, John. A comment and a question. The comment is to David. When you talked about China's, my words, not yours, withdrawal from Iran, if I can put it that way. What struck me just after Trump announced the US withdrawal from the JCPOA was in discussions in Beijing. The Chinese were essentially saying, we are not going to be the country which will help save the JCPOA. We're counting on the Europeans to do that. So I said, well, why is this? After all, your economy is as big as ours, and you have an economic complementarity with Iran, which is even greater than our own. And the bottom line was, we're scared of American sanctions. Of course, China was undergoing the ZTE sanctions at the time. So technological sanctions, financial sanctions. And I really got the impression, particularly when I learned, as you did a few days ago, about the CNPC and Sinopec being warned off buying oil from Iran. I really got the impression that the Chinese are ceding short-term ground to the US, notably via the Iranian affair, in order to gain time to reduce its dependency on American technology, on the American-led international financial system. So in effect, Iran is a secondary element in the grander scheme of things. The question is to Tom. You didn't mention Turkey once. This is sort of troubling because, well, geopolitics, like nature, abhors a vacuum. Syria has been pulverized, and the Gulf is divided against itself, and not simply along the Iran-Arab fault line, but also along the Qatar, non-Qatar, if I can put it that way, fault line. And the Turks, like others before them with the Russians, are filling the vacuum willy-nilly. 15% of Syria's pre-war population is currently in the Idlib pocket. And of course, Turkey is back in what they call the Bay of Basra. That's the Turkish name for the Gulf. They are back ensuring the defense of Qatar. What would be your advice as Middle East envoy, as you were, to HMG, the UK government, and indeed to the American and the French government, as to what we should be, how we should be handling Turkey's return to the region? Should we be playing with the Turks, against the Turks? Should we see them as a potential stabilizing force in the region, or as an aggravating cause in the region? I ask these questions, I don't know what the answers are. These are big questions, and the Khashoggi affair has really put the whole issue on steroids. So your thoughts would be very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. General Petraeus.
Thanks very much as well.
Yes.
And actually, with respect to Francois, just one quick comment on what you just said. about the guarantor of security for Qatar. I would respectfully submit it. It's the United States with the Central Command Forward Headquarters, the CAOC, the AFCENT, and 5,000 or so U.S. troops on their soil, give or take. My comment has to do with a takeaway from the conference, which is really that the imperative for patching up the relationship between the KSA and the UAE and Qatar is greater than ever, it seems to me, particularly with the reimposition of sanctions on Iran and with the focus on the enduring defeat of ISIS. It seems very clear that all of the GCC countries need to link arms and join the U.S. and others in confronting the malign Iranian activities and the threatening missile programs and all the rest. And so at a time like this, I'd just be interested in the panel's assessment of the prospects for reconciling the differences, which are quite well known, but in the wake of the Khashoggi affair, perhaps there is some new opportunity. And I even wonder, John, and by the way, congratulations on a very successful 2 days here to you and your team. But I wonder if this is the kind of task that IISS could take on to explore what the prospects are for doing this and even trying to promote them with the kind of academic and research support that you do so well. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. We'll definitely try to answer. Amr Musa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have 3 points to raise. First one is about the Mesa. One of the benefits of this dialogue is that it has introduced this issue to the public opinion in this region. The public opinion was not in the picture. And when news about this alliance were published, they were published in a twisted and vague manner. So this is the first time that we heard about an alliance of 9 countries, the United States, Gulf countries, Egypt, and Jordan. Then, of course, alliances, it's something natural, normal, that would be put forward by politicians, and we work, make them work. But then it was mentioned that it is the new NATO. Then, is it a military alliance? Are you preparing for war? NATO type in the Middle East means a military alliance. It's not a political, NATO is not a political alliance, or at least not only a political alliance. So here is the lesson. We are again resorting to the same old tactics. People would wake up in the morning and know that they have become members of a military alliance. And therefore, there is a possibility that this military alliance would be preparing for war. This needs clarification. This needs clarification. That's number one. Number two, about Turkey. Turkey is a very important member of this region. The return of Turkey, as was mentioned, is very important. And the success of Turkey depends on its image. Is Turkey back with the same philosophy and policy that differentiate between the political Islam, the moderate Islam, and the radical Islam? And this introduced a major confusion in the region and led to a lot of failures and, in fact, tension in the region. So it depends. Turkey is back. What is the message? What is the role? What do you want to do? This will be the issue. The third point was raised by the lady to the left about the conclusions. One of them is about Jerusalem. And I talked on that issue with Secretary Mattis yesterday. And the fact that the Palestinian issue has returned back. In fact, the Palestinian issue never disappeared. It just disappeared from some headlines in some Western newspapers or in the international newspapers. But for us in this region, it never went away. We are adamant, as the King Abdullah said in his message, that there will be no future to the region, no stability in the region without addressing and properly addressing the Palestinian question and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and of course the Arab-Israeli conflict. So the Palestinian issue is there on top of our agenda, and it is advisable that we work together to have a fine, fair deal in order to have the deal be fairly described as the deal of the century. And thank you very much for this conclusion. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Emma. Chungmin Lee.
Thank you, John. I have questions, one each for Tom and Kori. Tom, regardless of how Brexit goes, how do you foresee the UK's role in the region? Because if there is a hard landing or a soft landing or no landing, I would feel that Britain's posture here in the region is critical, not only for itself, but for its regional partners in Europe. So I would like your take on that. Kori, on the Trump administration, their policy is we do not care what happens inside countries. But the reality is that they have to. And the Khashoggi incident obviously attests to that. So if you look at Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Egypt, three of the most important allies of the US in the region, and they all have huge domestic challenges. How will those challenges, in your opinion, affect American foreign policy in the region? Thank you.
Thank you. Dana Allen.
Thank you, John. Question to David Gordon and a quick one to Kori. David, on trade, I wonder if I could ask you to speculate beyond the Trump administration. When President Trump was elected on what I think is really the first overtly protectionist winning platform since World War II, a lot of commentary applied a kind of natural historical heuristic, which is that we were going to see a return to the 1930s kind of chain reaction of trade barriers. I guess what we've seen so far in the US and the Trump administration is a series of kind of phony trade wars with America's neighbors and allies, which were resolved or seem to be on the way to being resolved with fairly cosmetic agreements. And then, as you suggest, a potentially more real and serious trade war with China. So my question is, post-Trump, whether that's 2021 or 2025, what's the natural sort of return state or equilibrium of trade behavior in the world? Is the world now kind of ideologically hardwired for free trade, and that's what we're going to go back to? Or is there going to be or will this period have accentuated or brought out sort of everyone's inner trade warrior? And to Kori, I really liked your remarks. I guess you're right that what has transpired has revealed that the Iranian nuclear issue was not as big an issue for American partners in the region as it was for the Obama administration, although you could have fooled me with Israeli rhetoric or Israeli pronouncements in the lead up. But my question is, assuming that Iran doesn't simply surrender to Secretary Pompeo's 12 demands, assuming that at some point the nuclear issue, the Iranian nuclear issue, returns with a vengeance, what do you imagine a future American administration is going to do? I mean, are we likely to see, again, I'm talking post-Trump probably, are we likely to see appetite for military confrontation and action?
Wagida Dega.
Thank you. First, congratulations on a very successful meeting, and I benefited tremendously from the conversation. There are three things that I hope to get a further input from you on, which I felt was not felt enough here. First of all, we don't know, or do we know, or how are we prepared for the repercussions post-November 4th? How do we study what Iran might do? Will they, for example, lie low, or will they escalate? And if they do, where will they escalate? Is it going to be, for example, let's take Lebanon as an example. We have a problem there. We have Netanyahu has already warned Hezbollah from the United Nations podium, and some are taking seriously the threats that he would implement this, sort of like take out your not only missiles, but the factories for making the missiles, or otherwise what are going to be the consequences and the repercussions? Secondly, I did not hear anybody speak much about Idlib. I think Idlib is going to come to be in the news next. I don't think the Russians are going to let go. And I think they want a military victory there. So therefore, the point to you is, what sort of conversation is taking place between the Russians and the Americans post putting Idlib on hold? And finally, if I may, look, everybody speaks about the tragedy of the Yemen war, and I absolutely agree. But I haven't heard much of how do we help them resolve it? What is needed to be done in order to put an end to this war and to this tragedy, given that we understand what each country's concerns are all about? I appreciate it I'd appreciate it if I get some answers to this. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We've been listening so carefully to your questions that we've been figuring out who's going to answer them. From Somalia, Abdul Khader Abdi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also congratulate you for a successful dialogue. I have benefited a lot, and my questions will be addressed to Ms. Comolli, and I agree with you to the analysis that you have brought here, and how the two regions of the Horn of Africa and the GCC are interconnected. However, while the peace initiatives that we are witnessing in the Horn of Africa was championed by the new Prime Minister of Ethiopia, who came in power about 6 months ago, there are also some other actors in the region that are not being acknowledged, and that is the role of Somalia. Especially Somalia played a role of connecting Eritrea and Djibouti together, and bridging the gap of a lot of mistrust and misunderstanding that existed in there. And I wanted you to address, if you can, how the Somalia, I do believe that Somalia is in a good place and to take advantage of this new stability and the new region of stability and peace that is in the horizon in the Horn of Africa, especially when you have the problem of Yemen that is in its infancy still, and when you have the conflict of Somalia that is taken almost 30 years, that is in the way of ending, and how that is interconnected. And also the trilateral agreement that has been signed between Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Somalia about economic integration and to stabilize in this region. I want to hear on your comments on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jeffrey Tantum.
Yes, one of the other issues that I'm not sure we've touched on in any great depth is the problem of Gaza, a place where people are living in inhuman circumstances. And more recently, of course, because of the demonstrations for the Independence Type Day, action by the Israeli army shooting dead well over 100 Gazans, often using dum-dum bullets, which are illegal, and more recently by heavy bombing. I wonder if any members of the panel had any thoughts on what might be done over this particular problem, because it is very much part of a solution to the Palestine issue.
Thanks very much. We're going to take two very quick ones, and then we'll come back to the panel. Jalil Abbas Jilani.
Thank you so much, John. I wanted to make one clarification with regard to a point that was raised by our distinguished panelist, Dr. Gordon, regarding concerns being expressed by a number of countries, including Pakistan, on BRI-related projects. I wanted to clarify that as far as Pakistan is concerned, there is absolutely no concern. The BRI's flagship project, which is China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, that enjoys the support of all political parties and all institutions in Pakistan. And as a matter of fact, the misunderstanding that was created was because of a statement by a minister that was misinterpreted by the newspaper. That has since been clarified. You also mentioned about the debt trap. Let me again clarify that as far as Pakistan is concerned, there is absolutely no debt trap. Out of the $100 billion amount that has been pledged for various CPAC-related projects, for infrastructure projects, for electricity generation, for industrial zones that are to be created, only 30% amount constitutes loans, and rest 70% is in the nature of investments. Obviously, Pakistan is under absolutely no obligation to pay the amount which is in the form of investments. And the 30% loan that Pakistan is going to get out of these $100 billion, the loan repayment period is from 20 to 25 years, and the interest rate is less than 2%. And the repayment will start again after some years, at least another 4 to 5 years, when we will begin to make repayments as far as the CPAC-related loans are concerned.
Thanks very much.
I have one question from Kori, which is quite somewhat similar to what Dr. Dana asked, and that is regarding the sustainability of the policies being pursued by the current U.S. administration. Do we see, because the current policies are not only devices internally in the U.S., but also externally as well? Do we at some stage see the return of JCPOA and kind of the other policies which were being pursued by the previous administration? Thank you.
Fleur de Villiers.
Thank you, John. I have two questions that are actually related, and I'll address them to both Virginia and to David. The first is on the Belt and Road Initiative and the possibility of this sort of being transformed into partnerships, particularly in the Gulf. Despite what our Pakistani friend has just said, there has been experience both in Southeast Asia and in Africa that when these partnerships are concluded, when they shake hands on it, suddenly one partner discovers he only has one hand and the other has three. The effect of the Belt and Road initiative, therefore, might not be entirely benign, even if it does change into partnerships rather than investment. The other issue, which also applies to Chinese investment in Africa, Virginia mentioned that the African Union's emphasis and stress has been on security rather than good governance. And there is widespread evidence in Africa of the malign effect of Chinese investment in Africa on the development of good governance in many of its countries, which in turn has, and I'd like to hear her comments on the effect this has had on a stimulant for mass migration out of Africa and the political effects on European security.
Thank you very much. Well,
just one more question.
Oh, sorry.
John, and that is to the entire panel. In the light of one remark today on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, I think, and others who regarded Minister Malawi's statement yesterday as truly electrifying, have been astonished by the way in which the media, particularly the Western media, have remained conspicuously quiet about it. I admit to being bemused by this lack of response and wondered if any of you had any suggestions that how we could unravel this mystery. Thank you.
Thank you again very much. So I'll go from my left to right. A couple of points to Virginia, a lot to David, a few to Tom, a lot to Kori. Virginia, you start.
Sure. I will start with the question on Somalia. So you're right, Somalia should have featured more prominently in my remarks, because I do think that Somalia is a very interesting and telling case studies to show us how these Gulf competitions actually play out. It is not just the competition among different Gulf actors, but it's also the internal competitions, as we have seen, for instance, the tensions that have been generated from interactions by the UAE with the self-declared independent Republic of Somaliland, for instance, and also the Puntland. But also at the same time, the partnership and relationship between Gulf states and the UAE in particular and the Somali federal government. So this is actually a very interesting case to show us how these tensions play out. Somalia is also a key, indeed, partner in the region because of the fight against Al-Shabaab, and we heard quite a lot about also the role of AMISOM yesterday. And I think the role of Somalia is key because, as I mentioned earlier in my introductions, these threats move across borders. Kenya and others are very familiar with the challenges of these jihadist threats moving across borders. So the role of Somalia is very much to be acknowledged here. With regard to Flora's point regarding China and the fact that sometimes these partnerships could have a malign effect, I agree with you, and we also heard yesterday during the 5th plenary how some of these contracts might actually have some consequences and conditionalities attached to them that could put recipients in some odd situations. We've had a number of examples from across Africa, also not just East Africa, but for instance West Africa, in which Chinese-led oil explorations were supposed to generate lots of new jobs for locals, but actually they did not, and actually resulted in increase in real estate prices and making just life harder for the locals. So I think you raise an incredibly important point here, and I hope that there are some lessons from previous Chinese engagement with Africa that African countries will actually learn and take forward. Thank you.
David.
Thank you very much. Let me address as many of these points as I can. I think China's appetite for post-war reconstruction in the Horn is actually going to be quite high. The Chinese have made a big investment in that part of the world, particularly in Ethiopia. They're very concerned about Islamic extremism re-emerging as a very powerful force. It is already, so I think the appetite will be high. In terms of BRI as being decentralized, it's a very, very, very good point. It's been extremely decentralized. Now, will it continue to be is an interesting question, because there have been some signals that China is going to give responsibility for coordinating the BRI to its newly established foreign aid agency. If that is done so, I think that we could see a somewhat different approach. Again, I think the creation of the Foreign Aid Agency was in and of itself an effort on the part of China to more constructively engage the multilateral development cooperation system. So if BRI comes within that framework, it could lead to some changes. On Francois' question on is the decision or the apparent decision on Iranian oil import cutback ceding a short-term ground to the United States? Absolutely. In fact, I would go broader. I see this as a confidence-building measure in the run-up to the meeting between Xi and Trump in Buenos Aires. But my point was, even before this, I think the Chinese have begun to shift their orientation in thinking about this part of the world. Extremely good question on, beyond the Trump administration, on trade. Where might we be going? So the China trade issue was going to become more problematic and conflictual, independent of who had won the 2016 election. That there's no question about that. So I think that piece of it, that even though I believe there will be some kind of an interim agreement reached between the U.S. and China in coming months, the range of issues over which, commercial issues over which the U.S. and China have serious disagreements is not going to be resolved anytime soon. What we're going to see as a broad response on trade post-Trump is very, very hard to determine at this point. That both political parties have frankly moved in a direction that is less pro-free trade. On the other hand, the U.S. business community, I think, would like to see more of a return to a traditional U.S. orientation. Finally, on this question of what will the Iranians do after November 5th. So if you listened to President Rouhani's speech at the UN General Assembly, you, I think, would have the takeaway, not very much, the options aren't very good. If you listen to the statements that have been made by various officers of the IRGC and particularly with Qasem Soleimani, you get a very, very different view. And I would say that I think particularly given that the efforts by the EU, Russia, and China to diminish the impact of U.S. sanctions will pretty much come to naught, in my view. So I think that will give another stick to the Revolutionary Guards with which to hit Rouhani. So I do expect escalation in the region, in Yemen, in Lebanon, potentially. I think the Iranians are definitely interested in stirring the pot with Israel, although I think that they also realize that Israel has tactical and strategic air dominance in Syria in terms of attacking their capabilities there, so they do not want to escalate past a point, nor do they want to bring the U.S. into a military role.
Tom Beckett.
I think just, I'll try and answer a few as quickly as I can. On the Yemen side, why has it had so little airtime? I think probably because from the UK and US perspective, it's politically very difficult, so why would you want to raise it in this forum? I think for Saudi and the UAE, I think aligning the military strategy with the political goals that have been expressed by the KSA-led coalition are also particularly difficult. It's been a slow, long grind, and the population has suffered. And then I think finally from the UN perspective, and I know Martin Griffiths isn't here to defend it, but getting the Houthi to actually talk about peace is also problematic. You know, they spent 4 months camped out at the generosity of the Emir of Kuwait, and nothing came of it. They were invited to Geneva most recently, and they didn't go. So that's why I suspect it's because it's a really tricky problem, and there's lots of interests who don't want to air it. I think on Turkey, Amma Musa probably answered quite a lot of that. I think from a policy perspective, I would say that my guess is that the UK view is that they're not clear yet what President Erdogan wants, what the goals and intentions of the overall leadership are, with a very challenged economy. And so therefore they'll want to stay close, not only because it's a NATO partner, but because it's an important part of the European as well as the Middle Eastern region. And I think the evidence of that was the first minister to make a visit to Ankara after the attempted coup was Sir Alan Duncan, the Minister for the Americas and Europe. But I think inherently the UK will remain suspicious of Turkey's tendency to think that there can be political pluralism, which is often a euphemism for including Islamists in the discussion. So I think they'll try and balance all of those. For General Petraeus on the GCC rift, I think you're right, it is more important that after Khashoggi it needs to be settled. But as one senior leader in the region said to me, remember, Tom, first of all it's the tribe, then it's the religion, then it's the nation. And I think the issues that are local will be dealt with first, and there is a deep local grievance that's going to be dealt with, and the only way it can be dealt with is in Riyadh. Even now, the only way it can be dealt with is in Riyadh before it becomes regional. And meanwhile, the defense reassurance of the Allied presence in the Gulf means that there is no prospect of an immediate war against Iran, because Iran doesn't want one. Going for Amma Musa on the NATO, the great thing about NATO is it never did go to war. You know, if you want peace, prepare for war. The difficulty in this region is that the region is ill-prepared for a war, so any alliance that comes out of that, ill-prepared for war and probably unwilling to prepare properly for war, so any alliance that comes out of that will be inherently unstable. Post-Brexit, I would say that the UK would continue to have a role. The successive defence ministers have said that Brexit doesn't particularly affect defence because NATO is the alliance that it is most involved with. It will take part in EU operations where they suit national interests. It is strategically now reinvested in the Gulf with the generosity of Bahrain by having the naval support facility here, a land training hub being developed in Oman. But all of those will be tempered by affordability, and if Brexit causes a significant shock to the economy, then it'll be less affordable and be the less forward deployed. And then the last one I'll do is on Gaza, and yes, the troubles within Gaza and around Gaza, but sadly I think all of those are on hold until we see the vision and light of the Kushner plan, and that's why I think there's probably a degree of skepticism about Yusuf bin Alawi's comments yesterday, because we've seen some of it before, but also anything that's so public may not yet be in a state to move anything on.
Kori Schake.
So I'll try and address 4 of the things that were fired my way. The first on GCC reconciliation. In addition to Tom's skepticism, I would add that I think it probably surprised the countries that attempted to isolate Qatar that it has sustained itself so well, and probably had looks to me to have had the unintended consequence of flushing out the extent of Turkish support for Qatar, and also for creating the possibility of Russian and Iranian support there in a way that I think is extremely unhelpful for GCC reconciliation, in addition to unhelpful for isolating Iran and for American interests in the region. On Yemen, I think Bobby Gosh is exactly right. Lots of reasons countries involved will want to avoid it, but I was struck by the extent to which Secretary Mattis talked about the details of potential peace negotiations. That's not something I have heard folks in the American government talking to before, and I think it's a measure of the extent to which Yemen is an example of the erosion of of the ability to make a clear moral case about who is on the side of light and who is on the side of darkness, because the narrative in media coverage of Yemen is no longer focused on either the Houthi surge and destabilization of the government in Yemen, or on how Iran has taken advantage of that to the detriment of Saudi and Emirati security interests, in addition to the detriment of the people of Yemen. It is now focused on the potential for the world's largest humanitarian disaster, and that makes it hard to sustain both the moral clarity. It also makes it hard to sustain the effort in support of security in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and the Khashoggi murder is only going to ramp that up in the American conversation. On the Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Egypt, well, one of the things those three countries all have in common is the narrowing of political and civic space in the last several years. And while the Trump administration, as many American administrations, would like to cast themselves as tough-minded realists in the world, the American governments always get dragged back to the fact that that values matter hugely in democratic societies, and in all three of those cases, I think there are, well, no, let me put it differently. Let's just use the example of Turkey, because I myself am homesick for Turkey circa 1999, where they were a model for the world of economic openness and growth, producing higher standards of living, and where you had a thriving and vibrant Islamic country that was also democratizing and was a model for the world. And I'm homesick for that Turkey, and think that unless we can find a path back towards that kind of vibrancy, political and civic vibrancy in many countries in the Middle East, the economic vibrancy isn't going to be adequate to solve the political problems. The future of Iranian policy. So, Dana Allen, in return for that diabolically difficult question, I want to retaliate against you by pointing out that since I was on the McCain campaign in 2008, Barack Obama campaigned against NAFTA in 2008. So this has been, as David Gordon said, a building dynamic in American politics where our political leadership is failing to make the case adequately that trade is in America's interests and that the trade agreements that we have merit sustaining. On the future of Iranian policy, though, your very good question, and here's where I want to end. One of the things the Trump administration, I think, has done extraordinarily well, and in particular has done it well in the Middle East region, is reestablishing conventional deterrence. I think the willingness to retaliate against the government of Syria for its chemical weapons attacks on its own people, the willingness to fire on Russian, loosely affiliated Russian actors who attacked American forces in Syria, the willingness to push back on Iranian efforts to close down freedom of navigation in the Straits of Hormuz and in the Gulf. The Trump administration has done a really good job of reminding potential aggressors that the United States is not so fearful ourselves of engaging in conflict, that we are self-deterred. And I think that's a really important example, plank to have laid down before we get to the point where the future Iranian policy comes back into the discussion. The second thing I would say is that American foreign policy, both in Korea and with respect, in the Obama administration in particular, with respect to Iran, have focused so much on the threat of nuclear weapons development that we have actually managed to reinforce the value of nuclear weapons to potential proliferators. It's how you get American attention. It's how you get American compromises. It's how you get big, splashy summits in Singapore with the President of the United States. And that, in fact, a more effective policy for American interests and for preventing proliferation would be to diminish the role of nuclear weapons in policy, in a way taking further this reestablishment of conventional deterrence by suggesting that any country in possession of nuclear weapons that would choose to threaten or use them is at risk of retaliation by the United States and its allies, and the leadership of that country will not survive that retaliation. I think that's actually a much more effective way to deter proliferation of nuclear weapons, in particular in countries like Iran and North Korea that are dictatorships.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm just going to add two brief points before concluding and asking you all to thank our panelists and others. First, to say that it was the case that at this Manama Dialogue, the Arab-Israeli issue rediscovered its centrality in two pretty important speeches. The first, obviously, the one by King Abdullah of Jordan. But I did think it striking, and was surprised that more people didn't think it striking, that Yusuf bin Alawi came to the Manama Dialogue with the single purpose of addressing the Arab-Israeli dispute and explaining and giving the first public account of the thinking behind the meeting that took place between Prime Minister Netanyahu and His Majesty Sultan Qaboos in Muscat. And all I can say from the IISS standpoint is that we will make certain that the remarks that he gave and the questions and answer session that his remarks inspired are on our webpage for people more carefully to examine and assess and perhaps draw stronger conclusions from that with the benefit of reflection and examination than some did on hearing it, though having been in the hall, I felt that there were some very historic statements that were made in that address. The second reflection I want to make is on the discussion we've had about the Middle East Strategic Alliance and the reminder that were such an arrangement to be ratified, it would obviously require the full-throated assent of American public opinion in the US Congress. But I thought it was really valuable that Amr Moussa reminded us that public opinion in the region also matters, and that an arrangement of that sophistication and breadth, which is supposed to cover financial, trade, diplomatic, and indeed military components, would require a stronger cushion of support in regional public opinion. Which brings me to the delicate issue of Qatar. I do wonder whether an element of the origins of the Mesa idea did not come from the exercise of a famous Rumsfeld maxim. Donald Rumsfeld, amongst many of his maxims, had one, which was, if you don't know how to solve a problem, you make it bigger. And the US administration for several months had been struggling to solve the Qatar problem. Rex Tillerson had failed, others had failed. They were keen to get a summit together of the GCC leaders, and in order to attract them, they had to come up with a bigger plan. Which struck me as called the Middle East Strategic Alliance, which would involve the 6 GCC countries, and a condition precedent for a summit would be that Qatar would be able to participate along with the senior representatives of the other 5 GCC. Obviously, an alliance had to bring in all the relevant countries, which meant Jordan and potentially Egypt, and also others who might wish to be engaged. The UK, France, and Japan were mentioned in the documents that were circulated for this. So I do imagine that while continued discussions will take place, and Adel Jubair stated that there had been discussions in Riyadh as between all 6 of the GCC countries, moving towards a treaty arrangement does look to me analytically as an extremely distant project. This Manama Dialogue has brought together 518 delegates, but we printed 3,000 badges to enable them to be here. There were at least 50 intergovernmental bilaterals that were booked through us, but many more that were arranged directly by the countries. It has been the biggest Manama Dialogue ever, and we at the IISS have, in preparation for this Manama Dialogue, visited virtually all the countries that have been represented here and spoken directly to the leaders and members of civil society to ensure that the strongest possible regional voices could be given expression at this dialogue. And as we work towards the 2019 one, we will find more ways to ensure that the regional voice is given full expression here, because the whole purpose of holding this dialogue in Manama, as opposed to London or the US or elsewhere, is to ensure that the voices of the Middle East are heard loud and clear and listened to by the people who travel great distances to come here. But I am, as host, really pleased that we had representation at this Manama Dialogue from North America, Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and Africa. And I do think that that's important and demonstrates and speaks to the way in which so many different parts of the world are having political, economic, security, and humanitarian relations with this part of the world. Let me close by offering 2 sets of votes of thanks. First, a vote of thanks to the Kingdom of Bahrain, to His Majesty the King, to His Royal Highness the Crown Prince and the staff of the First Deputy Prime Minister's Office, to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and the staff of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to the Bahrain Defense Forces, the Ministry of Interior, and indeed the people of Bahrain for the incredibly warm hospitality they have again shown to the international gathering that we have convened here. So please join me in thanking them. And second, I do hope that you will also help me to thank the extraordinarily hardworking members of the IISS staff. Many of them are arrayed to the left there, who supported nearly 3,000 people in some fashion or other here. Our tooth-to-tail ratio, as they say in military, is pretty good, and it's because they're incredibly efficient, incredibly hardworking. So before you leave for lunch and before you prepare to safely travel back home, could you certainly thank the 4 panelists here, but very warmly thank the hardworking people who supported them. And with that, we conclude the 14th Manama Dialogue, and please have an excellent lunch. Thank you very much.